In 1942, a highly secret organization with the cover name Services Reconnaissance Department began operating in this grand mansion in a Melbourne suburb. The building was headquarters for 380 special operatives who worked behind Japanese lines.
There was the guerrilla warfare characters. There was the bash artists who went in to try and get a chief or a Kepi Thai fellow or something and bring him out. And there was the demolition characters, and of course the intelligentsia like us who were in the intelligence side of the operations.
Services Reconnaissance Department, or SRD, was an Australian organisation of spies, saboteurs and guerrilla warfare specialists controlled by US General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. From 1942, SRD personnel were active in Japanese territory north of Australia.
You'll be parachuted in, they told us that. There could be Japs underneath, or there could be headhunters.
We had to live with the Dykes, we had to eat, we had to sleep, and it was a completely new experience.
The Japs didn't know who was doing it. They know they were being shot at and they were being killed. They were sending out patrols and they weren't coming back.
In October 1944, General MacArthur returned to the Philippines. While MacArthur had at first promised the Australian Army a role in the Philippines, he was determined to make this an American-only triumph. Australians continued to fight the Japanese in New Guinea, Bougainville and New Britain. It took until early 1945 for Allied commanders to agree on a new role for the Australian Army, to recapture the oil-rich areas of Borneo.
Also Australian political considerations. Curtin, the government's desire that Australian forces should be employed profitably after the ending of the major campaigns in New Guinea. And MacArthur's desire also to employ them in something that would be seen to be useful, but would keep them out of the Philippines.
Central to the plan were landings on Tarakan, at Brunei Bay and at Balikpapan. Services Reconnaissance Department were to insert teams into enemy areas in advance of the landings. But since mid-1944, SRD had also been involved in a plan to rescue Australian and British prisoners of war at Sandakan. Operation Kingfisher was planned for March 1945.
Z would be the advance party, and being a small group, they would land away from the jail and the prison, and come in to kill off the weapons in the prison itself, and particularly those weapons we knew to be in the dormitory or the main building. Altogether, it could have been a planned operation and a very successful one. I'm sure of that.
But in January 1945, after repeated Allied bombings, the Japanese stopped forcing prisoners to work on the Sandakan airstrip. They then took the prisoners on the first of two death marches across the rugged mountainous terrain from Sandakan to Ranao, a town at the foothills of Mount Kinabalu.
最初、捕虜のその服装とそれからその時の体力というか健康状態というかその時見た格好ですよね。まずこんな格好じゃとても私は航空なんか山へ入っていくからできんと思いましたね。
Early in the journey, the Japanese ordered the death of an Australian sergeant too weak to continue the march.
We just left him and carried on. And from then on, anyone who just couldn't keep up, of an afternoon they'd be crawling up a hill trying to keep up. You got to help them so far, and then if they start getting back, the Jap would hurry on and they'd shoot them.
In mid-February, when the last POWs had arrived at Pajinatan, a quarter of the 455 who had left Sandakan were dead. In March, the first American bombers flew over the Sarawak city of Kuching. Working in Kuching Hospital was nurse internee Lena Ricketts.
we never gave up hope anyway, especially when the Americans started bombing. And then, of course, one day they flew one plane flew very low over the hospital. I could almost see the pilot's face. He was so low, but they did not bomb the hospital. Just as well, I suppose, just before the war, they had a big red cross painted on the roof. And so I thought to myself, well, it won't be long now.
The Kempe Tai, or secret military police, were Japan's equivalent to the German Gestapo. Their techniques included local spy networks and torture.
This Kempe Tai, when they wanted information, didn't use a bulldozer. They used the things that would get their information, the subtle things. If pain comes in subtle ways, and over time, they're patient. They know that if they apply their methods over time, in all probability they will get their information.
Periodically from 1943, Lena Ricketts was interrogated at Kuching's Kempe Tai headquarters.
And each time it lasted 8 solid hours. And they would ask me the same silly questions over and over again. They asked me all about the Yanks and all about the British. And I told them that I was born there. I knew nothing about the Yanks and the British, what they're doing overseas. One day they put a sword in front of me. They wanted to lop off my head. I just stood there and looked at them. I didn't say a word. And then they were jabbering in Japanese. They must be wondering, good God, this girl. They thought that I would kneel in front of them and ask for mercy. I thought to myself, no way. I was thinking to myself, well, if you're going to do it, well, what can I do? I just looked at them straight in the eye anyway.
At Sandakan, the remaining prisoners were in desperate circumstances as the Japanese prepared for the second death march. Major Gort Chester, who had led Operation Python to Borneo a year earlier, played a crucial role in planning for the Sandakan rescue. However, events were to completely alter the fate of the POWs.
The events that intervened were, first of all, a flyover of Sandakan by Gort Chester in February of 1945, following which he reported that Sandakan appeared to be evacuated.
The proposed march rescue was delayed until the presence of POWs was confirmed. Operation Agus 1, commanded by Gort Chester, arrived by submarine in Borneo on the 3rd of March.
Oh yeah, we knew that the whole idea was to see what we could do about prisoners of war, and if we had to train natives to be guerrillas.
In April and May, Agus reported that all signs indicated that Sandakan had been evacuated. This was based on information from local contacts, and it proved to be tragically incorrect.
Between January, the date of the first death march, and May, the date of the second death march, there were still between 1,300 and eventually down to 700 prisoners of war still in Sandakan.
The rescue attempt never happened. By war's end, all prisoners remaining at Sandakan had died or been killed. Operation Agus grew to 5 parties and continued to collect intelligence and promote resistance until the end of the war. They set up hospitals and trained local guerrillas to attack isolated Japanese garrisons.
When we were there, we were a godsend to them, especially when you start getting drops of food in and helping them arm themselves and that sort of stuff. And I think if the Japs had only did the right thing and treated them right, they would have been more sided to the Japs than to us. But they come in and, of course, start bullying them around. And
early SRD operations had not realized the full potential of working with locals behind enemy lines. In Borneo, the impact of the Japanese occupation gave SRD a new opportunity.
And they were still looking for successes. They'd had the one single great success in Jaywick. Remio had been an absolute disaster, and GHQ had lost confidence in them, and they were very eager to find some success.
The Americans' capture of Morotai had provided an advanced air base for SRD's Borneo plans. Morotai now made it possible for B-24 Liberator aircraft to fly to central Borneo to support a new operation. This operation was codenamed Simut.
And the initiative really came from SOE. Firstly, to ensure the establishment of a British presence in Borneo post-war. Secondly, to harass the Japanese through the development of a resistance army. Third reason was to support the landings of the Australian 9th Division and Australian 7th Division later.
And that is really when we came into our own in Borneo and Sarawak and other areas, of course, as well. And those were the days when we really fulfilled our mission without any doubt at all.
A section of the Royal Australian Air Force, 200 Flight, was formed to provide transport for SRD operations.
From the moment we had that, our operations increased dramatically because we could say, yes, you'll do that without having to ask any headquarters.
Covered in dense rainforest, Borneo in the mid-1940s was relatively unexplored.
We went to Melbourne, and then we were briefed that we're asking you to volunteer to do a job in Borneo, and you'll be parachuted in. They told us that. There could be Japs underneath, or there could be headhunters. And if neither of those are a problem, well, then you can then you'll go on with the job we give you. But they didn't describe what the job was.
Sarawak's indigenous people were collectively known as Dayaks. They lived in traditional villages called kampongs. Headhunting was traditionally part of intertribal warfare. Despite British efforts to suppress it, headhunting was still practiced in the mid-1920s.
The collecting of heads or sometimes body parts is a ritual thing. It proves the man's manhood. And no self-respecting female would marry one unless he proved his manhood.
SRD's parent body, the Allied Intelligence Bureau, had set up a camp on Morotai in February 1945.
One of the things that did worry me at Morotai was that they said, would any of you, before you go in, like to remake your wills? And we'll look after that for you. That made me think, this is getting a bit serious.
In March 1945, liberators from 200 Flight began to insert Samut parties into the mountainous areas away from the Japanese bases on the coast.
And we were over the drop zone at roughly 7:30. Harrison's plane circled, and we saw Harrison and the other three exit.
As if to confirm Borneo's uncertainty, the clouds closed in as the second Liberator was about to drop its men.
Our pilot pulled out, circled twice, trying to get vision through the clouds or through the ground mist, and it was hopeless. So Rick Edmeades got on the intercom and he said to Frank Ball, "Go around once more, come what may, we jump. The others are gone, we've got to be there." So we went around, the green light went on and we went out.
Fortunately for us, the small figures we could see running around in and out of the jungle below us as we were coming down were not Japanese, they were natives from just the kampong.
And the next thing, the kunai grass parted, and here was a tall fella with leopard's teeth through his ears. I wasn't sure what to do, but he smiled and put out his hand and said, "Tubby, how do you do?" and or tabby, just tabby in Malay or Collabat. And once he smiled, I don't think people smile that they're going to kill you.
On the night of Samut's arrival, the locals turned on a traditional welcome.
The headmen sort of chanted how they were pleased to see us, like their mother and father coming back from heaven, and Harrison then sort of sang back how pleased we were to be there and all that sort of thing.
Come what may, I was a non-drinker, but I must admit that night I drank more than I've ever drunk in my life.
So we could hear this thing reverberating down the bloody valleys, and hoping there was no Jap within about 100 miles in case they heard it, because it was a hell of a noise going on out of this longhouse.
The party leader, Major Tom Harrison, had been to Borneo in 1932 on an expedition for Oxford University.
He was an outstanding leader, but had, in my opinion, quite a few eccentrics, in as much that he wanted eventually to be Chewin Raja, in other words, the inland king of Borneo.
He had no feeling for the troops underneath him. He had more feeling, I think, for the natives than he did for us as whites.
But I think he was very largely responsible in influencing the decision to drop us in from inland rather than try and put us in on the coast. And I give him credit for that, if he was, because I say that was one of the secrets of the success of the operation.
Harrison won over Borneo's Dayak tribespeople, turning their negative attitude toward the Japanese into an aggressive one. The arrival of a second SRD group and regular airdrops reinforced the operation's prestige with the Dayaks.
So we said there will be soldiers coming in big ships, there will be aeroplanes coming, the Japanese will be defeated. And you will be going back to what you had before the Japanese came. You will have your own homes.
Any operation of our type that went in like we did, that was the number one priority to get them on your side, was to look after them, to be directly opposite to what the Japs were.
Sergeant Jack Treadray set off through the Highland kampongs, providing medical treatment and recruiting for guerrilla work.
I took off on the third day with 4 kerosene tins of medicines and 6 of the women as my carriers. None of the men had volunteered, the women did. And I was away for 2.5 months. Day after day I'd visit kampongs, set up shop, treat them.
We had to live with the Dayaks, we had to eat, we had to sleep, and it was a completely new experience. And the Dayaks, whilst they spoke a little bit of Malay, and we had learnt a little bit of Malay in Fraser Island, it was a very difficult period of time, the first 2 weeks in Sarawak with the Dayaks, very difficult indeed. And it was only their, I guess, in retrospect, their humility which made it possible for us to live there.
We had to recruit some soldiers. We had plenty of volunteers from the Tuggles, and they're very warlike people, and they love to fight. So they made good recruits. Training had to be carried out to the extent we were able to do it, and all in a compressed sort of way, because we couldn't train them in the way you'd try and train a regular soldier or even a recruit into the AIF.
As local support allowed Samut to expand its territory, SRD headquarters increased the number of parties. From April 1945, Samut II embraced the lower and middle Barham River and its main tributaries. The next month, Samut III covered the Rajang River basin of southern Sarawak.
And having occupied, if you like, the heights, so to speak, at the top of the rivers, we had that advantage of moving down all the time with the information coming from the local people upriver to us.
We knew where the Japs were moving in large or small parties the moment they started to move.
The Samut parties hindered the Japanese by cutting off their supply of food and labour from inland. Eventually, the Japanese sent patrols to investigate.
And the Japs didn't know who was doing it. They know they were being shot at and they were being killed. They were sending out patrols and they weren't coming back. So I suppose the Japanese didn't know what was going on in there.
Sergeant Fred Sanderson of Samut 1 deliberately exaggerated SRD's strength to the tribespeople.
He said that there were 1,000 Australian paratroops behind us, and this would be passed round by natives with Japanese interrogating them. They'd say, oh, there's 1,000 Australian paratroopers coming into this place that we'd taken, so it diverted them a bit from coming our way.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight.
On the 7th of May 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies.
Peace bells are ringing through the capitals of Europe, but in the Pacific, the war against Japan goes on. Enemy-held strongholds lie like milestones on the road to Tokyo.
In May and June, the 9th Division landed in North Borneo.
Australian 9th Division troops, well versed in the methods of warfare, pour ashore to secure the beachhead. It's a case of grab and hang on. Starved from the brutal ill treatment of the Jap invader, this native shows in his cringing attitude the treatment meted out to him by his former overlords.
SRD operations Squirrel and Stallion had also gathered intelligence for the 9th Division landings in Borneo. SRD teams now launched direct attacks from the rear on Japanese garrisons.
That disrupted their plans because they were being attacked from the rear, which they did not expect. Because they did not expect such a force to have been organized behind them and to be able to attack them from the rear.
The Japanese suddenly started to appear all over the place like wild bees. They were patrolling to find out if we were anywhere near them or where, and if so, where and in what strength. They were patrolling for their own reasons to work out their escape routes if they had to withdraw from their present positions into the inland.
From mid-June, Samut patrols hunted the Japanese retreating along inland rivers.
My group, my boys and I, followed them on the banks and got ahead of them on the banks and set up an ambush, half my force to the right, half to the left. So I had them in a crossfire. And they weren't allowed to fire until my grenades went off. I always started things by throwing a grenade. I never threw them in the true army manner. I let the spring go, count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and threw them like a cricket ball. They were 6-second fuses. So when they exploded, it was shrapnel heading straight for the prows. If you threw them in the orthodox manner and they finished up underwater, they weren't much use.
By mid-1945, each of the Samut 1 operatives was working with a full-time guerrilla force of between 15 and 25 men. While the tribespeople used Australian rifles, they also practiced traditional forms of warfare.
And the Japs were very respectful of the Sompits because they had poison darts which were very, very effective.
The Dykes system was they'd hide off the track, let the party go past, and the last fellow go along get a Sompit poison arrow in his neck under here, around the back of the neck, and they used to call it 4-step. He'd be dead in 4 steps. His mate would be still talking away. He'd look round, his mate wasn't there. And then they'd just keep on, they'd get another one, another one, another one.
This is an Eban or Dyak parang I paid a can of bully beef for. They're beautifully crafted, they're concave, that's a right-handed parang, and with one swipe they can take a head cleanly off.
Whenever you killed any at all, they wanted the heads. really Harrison started headhunting again in Borneo, because in the early stages when we first got there, he offered 5 guilders for every Jap head that was brought in.
Some of our operatives were horrified at this particular operation, but it was part of war, behind lines, and unfortunately it did happen.
The Army was not happy about using headhunters because of the fact that it could cause unpleasantness with the Japanese hearing this. They would then feel that they're at liberty to ill-treat our prisoners of war more than they had up to date.
Corporal Roland Griffiths Marsh patrolled along the Meripok River with his local guerrillas.
Then one of my guerrillas discovered a perkakas, which is a footprint on the mangrove, brilliant trackers, and said, "Look, master," and he tested the consistency of it and the dampness of it, and he said, 5 minutes, we meet Japs. And sure enough, when the Japs saw us, it turned out there were 7 of them. They started to bellow and roar. One fellow raised his rifle, took a shot, which just missed me, and I dropped a couple, and Arthur, who was a Chinaman with me, called out, "Jangan menembak, jangan menembak, don't fire, don't fire, don't fire." It was all too close and was getting hideously mixed up. When it was all over, the Dayaks came up to me very proudly, holding up these heads as you would a fish with the fingers through the gills, only they had it through the jawbone, and that, showing it to me, "Look what I've got, look what I've got." They were pale, bristly, their face was bristly, the eyelids half closed, bits of spine and gore dangling from the base of the skull. And that's when the nightmare started, and from that day to this day I've had nightmares.
The 9th Division had achieved its first objective, recapturing the coastal oil fields. But for the 9th, there would be no more combat missions. The Australian government regarded Borneo as a sideshow to the remaining war effort and pressured the 9th to minimise casualties.
9th Division were not allowed to patrol inland more than a very limited perimeter. Mainly ones protecting Brunei and protecting the oil fields, which of course was one of the reasons why we were there.
Curtailing of the 9th Division's activities had a serious effect on CIMMET because the CIMMET operatives had assumed that 9th Division would join them in clearing the Japanese out of the island.
SRD operatives continued to work alone with their tribal recruits.
I'd sort of gone native and was starting to think as they did. And when you're by yourself, you haven't got anyone else English-speaking with you, you tend to just adopt their ideas and start to really think their way. When Sanderson came back up the river on an Australian barge at one stage, I started yelling out to him in Malay because I'd put aside English, and all the troops that were with him were wondering what the strange Australian fellow was that only spoke Malay.
As the weeks wore on, Tom Harrison's Samut 1 operatives were the most affected by this isolation.
The dark side of Tom Harrison was undoubtedly led by his enormous egotism, and he was an arrogant man. He didn't like control from outside or from within Borneo. He wanted to go his own way, and he treated the men under him very badly. There's not much doubt that he did withhold supplies from them that they desperately needed.
By August 1945, Roland Griffiths Marsh was seriously ill with dysentery. With no medical supplies, he was convinced he was dying.
I had, amongst the stuff I had got from the Japs, I retained a pistol, an automatic, very similar to a Luger, and I cleaned it and oiled it and tested it and had it ready for Harrison if he should come and visit me. And then I was going to shoot him and dump him in the jungle, and within a few days he'd be eaten by wild pigs and all the denizens of the jungle, and all the evidence would have gone. But fortunately Harrison didn't come. for him and for me.
SRD was now taking its operational directions from the Australian Army. In North and West Borneo, this meant the Army's 9th Division.
The expression was used that sergeants with private armies. Because, see, you've got to keep in mind that the 9th Divi, they were damn professional soldiers and bloody good ones too. And there's these mystery sort of blokes wander out of the jungle unshaven and that.
Commander of SRD's Borneo operations by this time was Lieutenant Colonel Jumbo Courtney. He was based at Labuan Island off Borneo's north coast.
Our operatives by that time had been living for 3 or 4 months in very, very uncomfortable and unhealthy conditions. Oh, they had malaria, they had dysentery, they had God knows what in the way of tropical diseases. Their uniforms had practically fallen to bits, as you can understand, in the jungle and so on. And you can understand, perhaps, that a young subaltern, a young officer of conventional forces, properly trained, coming across an SRD private, sitting under a bush, clad in a sort of T-shirt, you know, a pair of shorts or something like that, surrounded by headhunters and bodyguards, would have been a bit difficult to take.
Since I'd been through so much of this part of Sarawak, I was requested to go to 9 Divi headquarters and so they could have a talk to me like you're doing now. But they weren't as nice as you. He took one look at me, he said, when you're this major in his starch uniform, said when you present yourself reasonably as an NCO should, come back and I'll talk to you.
At Balikpapan on the 1st of July, the 7th Division made Australia's 3rd and largest Borneo landing.
Despite booby traps and mined roads, the tanks are soon rolling, moving up to the oil wells and huge storage installations that made Balikpapan such a rich prize for the enemy. Soon the fires, blazing testimony to the terrific waste of war, will be out. The wells back in production, and the oil will be Allied oil again, easing our supply problem.
Before and after the Balikpapan D-Day, 12 SRD platypus parties gathered intelligence, trained local people, and carried out diversionary operations against the Japanese.
They were using the waterways with barges, and we thought, or I suppose High Command thought, that they were going to across the Kuching by river, which you can actually do in stages, and they were gradually moving their dumps, their supplies, fuel and rice, etc. They're moving them along the rivers, and our job was to destroy as many of those as we could, and destroy as many Japs as we could, because we knew that they would eventually build up a bigger force.
In July, the fate of prisoners on the death marches from Sandakan to Ranau was still unknown.
When we got to Ranau, out of the 450 men that went on the first march, there were 6 alive. And out of those 6 was 2 that I escaped with, was Billy Moxham and Keith Bottrell. They'd killed them all off. They only wanted to kill us. They didn't want any survivors at all.
SRD's Agus III was asked to investigate what had happened to the prisoners. In early August, they received word of Australian escapees being helped by the locals.
I was pretty sick. I remember we were sitting down resting, and these commandos come around.
We came around the corner of the track, and I saw something which is indelibly printed on my mind. I shall never forget it. There were 3 people, 3 skeletons. They weren't people. 3 skeletons with skin on them. That's the only way that I could describe them.
And all of a sudden I look up, and these big 6-footers, all in jungle green, big lofty, and there's Skeets Haywood, and they said, "There you going, boys. Look, have a cup of tea, have this, have some, sit down, Down goes the stretchers."
They were swollen up with beriberi, there were bones sticking out here and bones sticking out there. We didn't think they'd last
the night. They were in such bad condition. We didn't think they'd last.
I looked at these fellas, and the thought ran through my mind. These are our brothers. I mean, without being, these are our brothers in arms. These are our soldiers. God, what's become of them?
Eventually, the POWs were flown to safety from an airstrip at Ranau.
When we subsequently met up with the Japanese, it took a lot of willpower and strength to stay away from them, because I knew that at least some of those Japanese that we were looking at had a hand in torturing and the treatment of these Australian soldiers.
On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 6 days later, the Japanese government surrendered to the Allies. On September the 2nd, General Blamey represented Australia at the formal Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. In Borneo, while some Japanese hadn't heard about the Tokyo surrender, others didn't believe it.
But there was an element in North Borneo, some Japanese forces still at large who had not surrendered, and it was the job of SRD to house these people into ultimate submission.
In mid-1945, the Japanese interned Lena Ricketts and her sister in the Sarawak township of Simangang.
And of course, the last day, they fed us with chicken and all sorts of things. And we were wondering. We thought, gee, perhaps they're going to kill us tonight, you know? Why suddenly we have all this nice food, chicken and all sorts of things.
In September, SRD's Corporal Brian Walpole led a party of 20 E-bands to ask the Japanese to surrender at Simangang. On his way, he passed through the township of Scrang.
Much to my amazement, the telephone's on a civilian telephone connection, and I felt a little bit cheeky, so I rang up the Japanese in commander. I got through to the Japanese commander in Simangan. I spoke to him in Malay, and I got put through to him, and I found he spoke a little bit of English, and I told him that I was part of an Australian battalion that was just out of town, and I was moving in. And he seemed to panic, and he hung up on me.
At Simangang, Walpole met not only the Japanese, but a woman who then disappeared from his life for 52 years.
Hello. Hello, Brian. Oh, nice to see you. And how are you?
Many years later, Walpole and Lena Ricketts were reunited.
Would you like to come in? Yes.
On the 14th of September 1945, 12 days after the Tokyo surrender, Brian Walpole arrived at Simangang.
We came out of the jungle, and the Japanese must have had a sentry there. They must have been expecting me or something. But a siren went off, and they opened fire with everything that they had. Well, naturally, we were retaliated.
We had firing guns. We rushed out of the bungalow, and then we saw all these Iban guerrillas fighting with the Japanese. The Japanese were trying to get away. They jumped into a boat, and from the boat, you see they were firing. And we ran into the ditch with these Ibans.
And we're right in the middle of this firefight. And out of the blue, down the hill comes this lady, as she wraps her arms around me and hugs me and gives me the biggest kiss of all time. Well, I said, down, down, I said. They're still firing bullets, these people.
And of course, when I ran down the hill towards Brian, I gave him a big hug and a big kiss. Of course, he was stunned. He just couldn't believe his eyes. He must thought he had seen things or something of the sort.
She got down, and we finished our little firefight business, and we rounded up the Japanese, the ones that weren't killed, or the Dayaks rounded up the rest of the Japanese. 5 wounded, I think, or something like that, and these nurses start to attend the wounded, and I couldn't understand why.
we were prepared to treat the Japanese. After all, I mean, they were already wounded. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're enemies or not. I mean, it's our duty to treat people anyway sick. And it doesn't matter who it is.
The next day, Lena requested a special ceremony for the Japanese.
I said, well, take them all out into the field. I said, and make them all face the setting sun, and make them bow 3 times to the setting sun, and tell them that Japan is sinking into the sea. I said, well, that's what they did to us every morning. Make us bow to the rising sun 3 times every morning to the rising sun, I said. So now it's their turn to bow to the setting sun.
Australians eventually accepted numerous surrenders from the Japanese between Sarawak and Nauru. From early August, Samut 4 monitored Japanese movements in western Sarawak. After the surrender, the party made supply runs and restored civil administration in the Bintulu River Basin. As Lieutenants Rowan Waddy and Alex Hawkins arrived at one kampong, the entire population vanished into the jungle. The party's Dayaks called out that the visitors were Australians, and the villagers gradually returned.
To show you how pro and they were for the British, there's an old lady came up to me, bent over at my feet, and put 2 eggs near my foot, and saying in Milano, thank you.
Waddy and Hawkins' Dayaks were led by Pangulu Blaja.
Pangulu Blaja is my blood brother. He wanted to put a tattoo on just under my chin, right down the chin and around under the chest, which means that you qualify as a warrior of their tribe. And it's a very proud thing to have. And Alec and I were pretty damn touched to be asked to have this.
We didn't want to do that, of course. We could imagine ourselves going out to a party when we got home eventually, and we'd look a bit funny in a white tuxedo or something, and white tie and tails or whatever, and a big tattoo running from our chin down to our chest.
So we had a compromise and put the tattoo on our left wrist under where you wear a watch. And I'd show you this watch now and you can't see anything. But underneath there is a tattoo. Now that tattoo is on Pangulu Blaja's left wrist and on Alec Hawkins' wrist.
So Waddy decided he wanted 3 dots on his wrist in a triangular pattern. And I thought, well, I'll have 3 dots on my wrist just to be different to Waddy, because anything he wanted I'd be different with. We were just like that. And so I had a straight line. I had 3 dots across my wrist in a straight line.
It wasn't until October that SRD's last field party, led by Tom Harrison, set off in pursuit of the Japanese Fujino force, which had refused to surrender.
We ended up in Bilalawit and Barrio. There was a bit of a firefight, but we had a lot of natives there. Some of them had Owen guns. A lot of them had their blowguns, their sumpits. So we convinced them it would be far better to surrender. There were 320 odd Japs, 3 Korean prostitutes and 1 baby.
Leaving local supporters at war's end could be an emotional wrench.
At that stage I had been with my tribal soldiers for some considerable time, and together we had experienced quite a few traumatic incidences, and I think we got very close. But when I had to leave them, I was absolutely devastated. I felt, number one, that I was leaving them in the lurch. Not that they would be in any more danger, because the war was over, to all accounts, with the Japanese, but that I hadn't done sufficient for them.
By the Japanese surrender, the combined Samut parties controlled most of Sarawak, southern British North Borneo, and northern Dutch Borneo.
And I think the successes achieved were outstanding. I think we formed a resistance group of something in the order of 1,800 to 2,000 natives, and about 80 SRD people were involved. against that, they wiped out something like 1,800 to 2,000 Japanese.
The main value of SRD's activity was no doubt that of re-establishing control for smooth control to post-war conditions.
As far as demobilization was concerned, all our parties had taken the name and numbers of all people who were recruited within the countries and were given arms of some description, and those arms were taken off them at the end of hostilities when the final Japanese had surrendered.
The organisation which took over the civil administration of Borneo from SRD was the British Borneo Civil Affairs Unit, or BCAU.
The role was to re-establish in Borneo civil government, and so BCAU did that quite effectively, but mainly they owed that to SRD's activities. So much of the area they could just move in and take over directly from SRD people.
As a consequence of which Sarawak and British North Borneo were one of the very few ex-colonial territories which were not faced with an insurrection pretty soon after the war.
Since March 1945, SRD had continued its work in 4 other regions of the Southwest Pacific. Besides the continued Timor operations, there had been copper on Mushu Island, optician and crocodile in the South China Sea, and around a dozen operations in the Celebes and Halmaheras.
Men of the 7th and 9th Division, 2 Australian divisions famed for the battle honours they have won, from the Middle East to the Kokoda Trail, have clinched their final victory with the Battle of Borneo. The troops have arrived, and up they go, 1,300 of them. And now from those crowded decks, they are looking at the land they fought for, the land that is ready to give them a rousing welcome home at Brisbane.
At war's end, Australia's 9th and 7th Divisions were welcomed home as heroes. Of SRD's role in Borneo, there was no mention.
At the end of the war, we received a direction from SRD headquarters that we would destroy all records that we had in our possession. And in my department, we certainly did just that. So I have got one scurry of information with me.
Everybody left. I was left there, the only officer. My job was to close the camp up. And I tell you what, we closed it up very quick smart. All the secret stuff was sent back to London and by ship, and all the English chaps were sent down to Melbourne, sent back to London, and bang, bang, bang. It was very quick.
The closure of Z and SRD was very disappointing, really, because to express it, I'd say it all just fell flat. Just fell flat. We all went different ways. We didn't get together. We weren't all called to Melbourne to sort of say goodbye. Nothing like that. You were just posted off.
Apart from Operation Jaywig, the history of SRD and its Z Special Unit were kept secret until the mid-1980s.
In fact, I've never ever discussed with anybody what I'd done in Borneo. Even my late mother and father knew nothing. My 2 sisters know nothing. I've never ever told my wife of 50 years anything about my experiences.
My chief, my master, who I'd worked for from the age of 14, and I'd gone back after the war. I dressed up in my uniform that morning and told him that I needed time off. I was going down to Government House, and he wanted to know what for. And I said, just for an action during the war, and that was it. You just blotted it out. You just couldn't talk about it.
Gradually, people started to talk to one another about it again, and so somebody suggested, well, we'll have a reunion, and that's really how the whole thing started off.
It wasn't until 1970 that the Z Special Unit Association began regular national reunions.
They were a great relief because we were finally able to discuss with each other what went on, what operation were you on, what operation so-and-so was on, what happened to so-and-so.
And I think when the reunion started, that's when we started to open up, because it was a form of counselling.
It's always good for them to talk about something they've done with somebody who understands what they went through.
Finally, in 1984, the official history of SRD became publicly available for the first time. One of the first to receive a copy was Laurie Black. At the 1984 Z Special National Reunion, he began to reveal the story of Australia's special operations.
And it was the first time we got hold of the whole official history. And I had the pleasure, nobody had it, and I had the pleasure of getting up and saying that Joe Blow done so-and-so and so-and-so. They didn't know this. And that was, I think that was the start of all getting together and saying, oh, he done so-and-so. You were there, I didn't know you were there. I was up the river somewhere.
When an infantry battalion has a reunion, they all know each other, particularly the ones in the same company, but in the same battalion. We were different. We operated in ones and twos behind the lines. So the importance of our reunions is to like a jigsaw puzzle.
Besides the 380 Australian Army operatives from Z Special Unit, SRD had employed other service personnel from around the British Commonwealth. There were also civilians from Timor, Borneo, and Indonesia. Today, the numbers at Z Special reunions are dwindling.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
But for most of those who remain, their time with SRD was a high point that would shape the rest of their lives.
All the excitement and thing was terrific, and the time with the natives was, although very frightening, was marvellous. I suppose I grew up from being just a college student to I suppose, becoming a man.
It was exciting. One minute you're parachuting, next minute you're in a submarine, and let's face it, it's a bit more exciting than just running around training chaps for tranquilizers and all that business.
But my experience in Z was something that the average person would never ever have in his lifetime in any other unit but that.
I lived with headhunters. The greatest adventure anybody could have. And I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
I think when you've accepted the worst and then gone on from there, you have a different attitude to life than those that haven't been pushed to the limit. Because in one way or another, whether it was parachute training or Fraser Island or up in the islands themselves, we were pushed to the limit quite often.